Hello and welcome to the AIS webinar series. Today we'll be looking at Does Bigger Mean Better? Working towards a big Australia, or the pseudo title, which is What Should Australia Look Like by 2050? My name is Hermant. I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Intercultural Society. For those of you who are joining for the first time and being introduced to the AIS, as we call it, the AIS is a not-for-profit organisation established in a pre-9/11 world with a view of strengthening mutual respect and understanding between people of diverse communities through meaningful engagement. And tonight's program is an example of this. Just wanted to let you know of some upcoming programs which will help and increase our understanding of certain topics. Next Monday night at the same time, we'll be looking at prayer, patience and pandemic with Trinity College, the University of Divinity and the Islamic Sciences and Research Academy. We have an all-female cast to run through prayer and patience during the pandemic period that we're living through. On the 6th of August, we've got a panel or a conversation on homelessness titled There's No Place Like Home, and we'll be partnering with the Salvation Army and the City of Melbourne. On the 12th of August, we'll be giving the microphone to the youth, and they'll be asking us to shut up and listen. We'll be presenting the microphone to some multicultural youth voices, and we're partnering with Victoria University along with a few other stakeholders. And on the 15th of September, the Equal Employment Opportunity Network Summit will be held, and that is hosted by EON and a range of partners, which the AIS is proud to partner in. So look out for all those details. You could catch up on all of the latest on our website, www.intercultural.org.au. Just a reminder with regards to tonight's program, you can ask questions in the chat section, so feel free to ask questions as the conversation takes place. In terms of tonight's program, it aims to look closely at how Australia should look by the middle of this century. We're hoping we won't be talking about this COVID pandemic within a year or two, but this disruptor will naturally change labour mobilisation as we know it. And it requires governments to think critically about sustainability. Supporting innovation and industry will be key criteria. A key ingredient in the mix is to have a healthy working population to support this economic program. However, what does that mean for our immigration policy, social cohesion, and national identity? And to have the conversation to kick it off with our two distinguished panelists, it will be Ms. Maria Vamvakinou and Dr. Katie Allen, who will be introduced shortly. I'd like to introduce our moderator, who is the ABC Social Affairs Correspondent. His coverage areas include aged care, social welfare, and disability rights. Previously, he was the ABC's Moscow correspondent, and he has reported and worked as a video journalist in various international locations. Originally from Toronto, Canada, prior to joining the ABC, he was also a national reporter for Canada's CBC. I'd now like to hand it over to my good friend, Norman Hermant from the ABC. Norman?
Great, thanks very much, Ahmed. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we are on and pay my respects to all nations' elders, past, present, and emerging. Thanks everyone for joining us. In recognition of the UN's World Population Day, the AIS convened this program to explore what Australia should look like by 2050. Now, Australia's population is always controversial, and you hear arguments for and against a larger Australia. The question is how Australia will look like in the next few decades from an economic, political, and social cohesion perspective. And to discuss this, we have two federal politicians who have obviously a vested interest in this question. We have with us Dr. Katie Allen, MP, who is there with a very happening, funky background from her electorate of Higgins. She's got a medical background as a pediatrician, worked at the Royal Children's Hospital for 28 years. She's also held a professorship at the University of Melbourne, amongst other qualifications, and entered Parliament in the last election. Katie currently sits on the Joint Standing Committees for Trade and Investment, the National Broadband Network, the Parliamentary Library, Industry, Innovation, Sciences and Resources, and Communications, and the Arts. So welcome very much, Dr. Katie Hall. Thank you for joining us. And then, of course, we also have with us Maria Vamvakinou, a federal member for Calwell. Now, she joined Parliament in 2001, has a background in education, has an interest in immigration, employment, healthcare, and education. She's a deputy chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Migration and a committee member of the Joint Standing Committee on the Foreign Affairs, Defense and Trade. She also convenes the Parliamentary Friends of Multiculturalism group and the SBS group. So I'd like to thank you both very much for making time to join us tonight.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm going to start with Maria Vamvakinou. Maria, you've been in Parliament since 2001. You've seen governments come and go. You've probably heard this debated. You've been on committees that are looking into this. From your perspective, what should Australia look like in 2050?
Well, to try and answer this question, Australia needs to look like a country that has been able to get the appropriate balance in terms of growing its population. It should be a country that is sustainable, livability is okay, opportunity and cohesion. All those factors are actually in sync and working well, because I envisage that we may be looking at a population increase of another 10 million potentially by 2050, because our ageing population and the region in which we sit as a country has changed so much, and our involvement in the global world is such, it's irreversible in the sense. So therefore, we need to work out how we're going to balance our population and our country so that by 2050, it actually ticks all those boxes that are required for a sustainable, livable country with opportunity for all, but also a country that has an expanded economy that actually underpins all the livability and the opportunities and the delivery of services. So I expect that we're going to be a country that's continuing to grow. And I also expect that given in recent times, our two major sources of migration have come from our region, from indeed India and China, under various visa programs, in particular international students and skilled migration. As someone who's got a deep interest in the cohesion, social cohesion and the Australian identity, I envisage that by 2050, the Australian identity and the face of Australia will have changed and will, in many ways, if I can say this, begin to look very much more like the Asian neighbourhood that Australia currently, is in as a country. It doesn't mean that we're not going to be very European looking, but it does mean that we are going to be more integrated with our Asian and subcontinent neighbourhood. And I believe that most of our interactions, both on economic front and education and other areas, will be integrated into our neighbourhood. So we will be, I imagine, very much an Asian country. We will be very much an Asian country, or a country in Asia that has a lot more in common with its neighbourhood than it would have had previously or at the moment. So I think that's where our future is heading, and it's inevitable because that is the reality of our situation.
And Dr. Katie Allen, there was a lot in there. This is what we heard was an Australia perhaps of 35 million, maybe more from 2050, a country that is more on the face of it, looking like more an Asian country than it is today. What do you see? Do you think that all of that is good? Is that how your vision is for Australia?
Thank you, Norman. Look, there's lots of issues that I completely agree with Maria on this, and I think there's a lot of people who look to Australia, in the sense of three ways of thinking about it. I suppose when I think about where Australia will be in 2050, I would think about our people and our cities. What is our population? What is the blend of our population? What does our city regional environment look like? The second thing is, what are the jobs that people have? What's driving our prosperity? What are our resources? Because we rely on jobs, but we also rely on resources, and what will that look like? And that leads to a natural question of, what's energy mix look like? Because, of course, we are very reliant on our natural resources. So what will the natural resources mix look like? And then the last sort of area I think about when I think about 2050 is our place in the world. So how do we interact with our trading partners? Where are our strongest connections? Where do we put our emphasis when we think of our diplomatic and international relationships? So with regards to people and cities, I do believe we will continue to grow. We've been growing at 160,000 net migration in Victoria alone. And I think that we will continue to grow quite rapidly because we are a destination that people value. And I think that's something as Australians we should think about in a very positive way. I truly believe, having travelled internationally as a medical researcher and professor and worked in other countries, that we are one of the most, if not the most, multicultural, multi-faith, tolerant communities in the world. We haven't had to shed blood on this continent except for, unfortunately, the Indigenous situation. So put that aside, that's a terrible past, and I think a nation that is at peace with its past has to deal with how we've dealt with our Indigenous First People. And I think there is a bipartisan view that in this Parliament we may be able to make good and significant steps towards recognition, into recognition and reconciliation as a result. So I would expect by 2050, if we're going to make some significant strides in the next 3 years, I would hope the next 30 years that we will have accepted the wrongs of the past and moved on and closed the gap of some terrible disparities we have with our First People. I think we will be a bigger country. I think that COVID will provide a small hiccup, but because we are a great destination for people, I think we will continue to welcome migrants, immigrants to Australia. We all know that prosperity is based on population, activity and participation. So we have done very well out of having a welcoming approach to skilled migration. I think that will continue. I think that our cities will undergo quite a significant transformation. I think there is a big head of steam behind. We cannot continue to just pile everyone into increasingly densified cities, and I think we need to have a good and strong and robust conversation with our populace. It can't just come from the top. It needs to be an engaged conversation about what we want to look like as a built environment. We want to just keep densifying our cities, increasing our congestion, causing more frustration for people getting to and from work in a timely manner and having pollution? Or do we want to decentralise and have more vibrant regional hubs with good schools and hospitals and good transportation that's clean, getting us to the employment hubs, having universities in the regions which allows young people to find their partner and perhaps set up shop, so to speak, in these regional hubs. And I'm a big believer in decentralisation. Having grown up myself in Albury-Wodonga, it's a wonderful environment to live in. And I think COVID will have a number of different legacies. But one of the legacies, I think, is that people are realising they can work from home, and that we will see, particularly for knowledge economy workers, the use of what women have been doing for a long time, which is flexible work environments, which includes working from home in some ways. And therefore, that will allow people potentially to work in these pre-changing environments or sea-changing environments. So I think we are going to see a rapid move to online workplaces, but also decentralised workplaces. With our jobs and our resources, we're going to see an ongoing movement of digitalisation of our economy. Our knowledge economy is going to become greater as we move forward, and I think it's important that we ride that wave because we're a very educated and capable community, and I think there's lots of opportunity for us to develop our services in the region, whether it's health services through telehealth, whether it's financial sector services, tourism services, a lot of services and knowledge that we can provide knowledge leaders in our region. And I think there is going to be a pivot from reliance on fossil fuel to new energy sources. So that includes, of course, renewable energy, but we need to find some solutions that both how to store energy, new energy for our own purposes, but transmit it so we can then ship it overseas. So things like the hydrogen projects that we're investing in, I think, are very important projects to move both for sustainable future in Australia to be able to ship sunshine overseas, as Alan Finkel, the Chief Scientist, is want to say. And I think things like electrification of our transportation will have arrived and be fully rolled out in the future. With regards to our place in the world, I think our Pacific Step Up is a good place for us to be, because I think Australia has a good leadership role to play in the Pacific, and I would include the Indo-Pacific in that. So I think both Indonesia and India are an important extension of our Pacific Step Up. I think we'll see a closer alignment and more diversified alignment. China will continue to be an important trading partner for us, and will continue to be close allies with China, but I think we've all learned that we need to have a diversified trading portfolio and trading relationships so that we can all remain honest brokers in a global world. I might stop there, but to say that the other thing that I'm passionate about is ensuring that we have a healthy, educated, trained future generation. So I'm very passionate about ensuring that our young can feel hopeful about it.
All right, that's a long list, and I'm sure all of us would love to see all of that happen. Now, whether it can all happen, that's really what's interesting to discuss. Maria Vamvakinou, I'll put it to you. One of the things that was said there was that really our prosperity depends on growth. Do you agree with that? Do we have to get bigger in order to maintain our prosperity?
Well, we have to have a sufficient capacity to grow our economy, to pay our bills. We have to have budgets that allow us to go forward with a lot of the projects that Katie did refer to a large number of areas that we have the potential to grow in. We need, population is important to that. I think back on, and I should have said this initially, when Australia has, for me, the next 30 years are the fourth phase of what I understand Australia to be. If we start off with our Indigenous First People and our history there, and then we enter the white settlement, then you move forward to post-Second World War, the great nation building enterprise that was implemented by the then Labor government, and indeed Arthur Calwell as the first immigration minister. The view at that time was very much about population and growth, not just for the economy, but Australia had, we'd kind of dodged a bullet in relation to Japan and possible invasions, hostile invasions. And Calwell and politicians at the time very much said that there's no way we could hold this Australian continent with what was 7.5 million people. So population growth was about the economy, but it was also about security. Now, it could be that a similar, and then going forward, world security is going to be an issue. And at the moment, of course, things are not as stable as we would like them to be. And I think a lot of people are very worried about the global, the global world order and what it means and how it will reshape, if at all. And certainly a lot of the discussions in our neighbourhood in relation to China and the United States are causes for concern. I'd like to think that will be a passing phase, that's probably some geopolitical tensions that we may all get through it and carry on. But we always have to be mindful about security. But our country needs to replenish its population. I remember when I came into Parliament, John Howard was the Prime Minister at the time, and Peter Costello was the Treasurer. And there was a lot of discussion around, I think Australians were only producing 1.5 babies. I mean, our birth rate was quite low. And the government at the time introduced, this program, immigration program around family reunion and skilled migrants with about 160,000 people per year. So we control our immigration program and always have controlled it, and we do it in a way so that it actually meets the needs of our current and future projections. So we will continue to grow because we have to continue to grow. If our population ages and we've got more of an ageing population and less of a younger working population, then we can't grow our economy. We can't do the things that we'd like to do. So we need to continue to grow. The question is that growth needs to be balanced with all the things that we know, all the things about service delivery, opportunity, sustainability, the environment, all those things need to be balanced. And hence governments, when they do forecast their policies and they set their targets in relation to immigration, they do it with with knowledge and awareness of what we need. So the levers we control, and we need to continue to grow. And I'm confident that our growth will be a good balance so that we can get the outcomes that we need to get. The reality too is that there are 80 million people. I came into Parliament 18 years ago. There were 20 million people, displaced people in the world. Every 5 or 6 years, that number just kept going up, 20, 40, 60. Now it's projected to be 80 million people. Katie's right. We are a country that people want to come to. And we want to do the best for our country, but we also need to be mindful that security also depends on the developing world being able to, to develop in a way where we can mitigate the movement of people. I mean, 80 million people, a lot of people, and there aren't many developed countries in the world that actually are capable of offering solutions to what we do with people who are displaced either by war or by poverty. These are major issues, and I believe Australia has a very important role to play in finding answers and solutions to a global problem that isn't going to go away. I mean, we can't put a ring around Australia and a fence around Australia and say, well, right, we're only going to take in as many people as we think are necessary because we've got to look after ourselves. We do, but we live in a global community and there are global problems that need to be addressed. And Katie referred to the Pacific Step Up. I mean, that's part of us stepping up in assisting our Pacific neighbours, but Australia needs to play a role internationally as well. So we balance our own population and look out for our own interests, but at the same time, I think we also have to offer solutions and provide assistance for other countries so that we can actually make a significant contribution to stability and world peace, because I think stability and peace are a major issue in the next 25 to 35 years, or maybe in the next 10 years. So we can only prosper if the world largely is stable. If there's instability, it's going to affect us, and I don't think that we can not have a view and not be active, proactive in that space.
I mean, certainly, Dr. Allen, that would have, one of the ways Australia engages with that is it does have this incredible diversity of population, people from all over the world, and it gives Australia connections all over the world, and that's a huge geopolitical advantage for Australia. But it also has come in the past with some political sensitivity. It's not always popular to throw open the doors. Do you think Australia's targets are about right? Do you think they should be, would you like to see them increased, decreased? I mean, what is the right size of our population mix?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the international population growth reports have come out recently and looking at the year 2100. And what's interesting is that there's some surprises in these predictions of growth. And one of those is it's always been assumed that Asia will be continuing to dominate. And that is not the case. There looks to be Africa will become much more dominant in terms of population. Not all dominant, is where most of the growth will come from. Asia is going to start to plateau. Now, that's partly because the Chinese one-child policy, which has now gone to the Chinese two-child policy. But Asia is not growing at as fast a rate of, what we have been concerned about, I suppose, in the past. And it's become quite stable as a region. And the other thing that surprised me was that I'd always thought we just keep growing until we kind of stopped. But in fact, the population demographers predict that we're currently at 7 billion, but we will probably plateau at 9 billion as a planet in 2100. So that is actually not as frightening as we would think. And so it suggests that there will be a natural point of steady state for the population, and we need to therefore start planning now for how do we feed and water and provide enough energy for everybody around the planet in a safe way. Now, I do hear people's concerns about how many people can we fit into Australia, and I don't like to see it in that way. I see that Australia has a very strong role to play in being a good global citizen to protect our own citizens, but I also believe in prevention is better than cure, and people do come to this country because they want a better life or for many reasons. But many people don't want to leave their own country, and they're forced to leave their own country. And there is this big problem of displaced persons in the world. So the number is so overwhelming that anyone who's humane and cares about the global population can feel very, very overwhelmed. And I think that it's more important that we spend time providing foreign aid through education, health, make sure that we can support people from becoming displaced people. And, we can only control what we can control, you could say, and it can be a bit overwhelming. You think, well, how can we help 60 million people around the world? I think that's where Australia needs to provide leadership locally in its region. And that's not to say we shouldn't provide leadership in Europe or in Africa or elsewhere, but we're a middle order power. We don't have measurable resources. No one does, but our resources are obviously not as great as the US or Europe. And I think we need to look very carefully to our Pacific partners, and particularly Papua New Guinea. There are 8 million people in that country. In fact, they think there's 10 million people. They don't even have a birth census. They don't even know how many people are in that country. And so it's a wonderful country. It has some significant governance issues and security issues internally. There's a lot of work being done up there, and I think that Australia needs and continues to have an important responsibility. People don't want to leave their country. They really don't want to be asylum seekers. They don't want to have to look for shelter. So we need to do what we can to make sure that people are supported in their own country with their own families. And that is a different question from the skilled immigrant question. And I think Australia has always been very supportive of skilled immigration portfolio, and we'll continue to support that. But we also need to be responsible global citizens. We need to take our share of displaced people or asylum seekers, but we also need to work very strongly into the regions that we can provide ongoing support so that people can not be exposed to civil unrest. And I think there is a lot of work that's happening in the Pacific with regards to helping to stabilise the region and to provide good leadership so that there's not predatory loans into some of these countries, that we provide support for their governance, that we provide support for health and education of their citizens as well.
Maria Vamvakinou, I'm going to go with a two-part. First of all, picking up on what Dr. Allen just said, there are some who say that perhaps while we have a focus on security, and that is obviously a very important issue for Australia because this is becoming a very complicated neighborhood to live in, they would like to see that focus matched on the diplomatic side, because some of the things that Dr. Allen is talking about is more investment in diplomatic outreach, especially in this region, which some people have said has been a victim of underinvestment, that particular side of it. The other thing is, and the important question that I think a lot of people always ask is, do you worry about this constant strain at some level in Australian politics of pushback against a greater opening of the population? I'm talking about some of the populist political strain that never really goes away and exists in a minority sense in terms of what our population makeup is. Does that ever give you concern that if we were to truly, as you say, look more like our Asian neighborhood, that could become a more polarizing issue for the country?
No, it doesn't worry me. And I actually do think that political leadership, and I mean that for all countries, but ours in particular, is critical to how you handle these sorts of debates around identity and Australian, who is an Australian and who isn't, because that's really what it's all about in many ways. I think back to my own experience. When I came here when I was 4 in the early 60s, I can recall, experiences, and I'm sure everyone can, of the way the local Australians, I mean, we were called the New Australians. This was Calwell's term for his great migration program, was New Australians. So, the existing Australians, and I'm not talking about the first people, the Indigenous people, I'm talking about the Australians that I thought were Australians anyway, until I realised later on that I was one as well. But I had to work for that. They weren't obviously very keen to see all these people who looked different, spoke different languages, had different eating habits, different cultural habits. They would have. I now sympathise with them. 58 years later, I feel that I understand where they were coming from. And if I was to go back to my neighbourhood in 1965 and ask my neighbour, who didn't like us, who didn't like any of us in the street and spent a lot of time being very abusive, are you happy with Australia all these years later? I don't know where that neighbour is, but I would guess that their response would be, yes, and by the way, I don't think you guys are as bad as I thought you were. And I think that is the history of this country. We come in waves, and each wave will experience a certain amount of angst, possible resentment, because there might be a bit of a difference, which is why I made reference to our two source major countries of migration, India and China, and our neighbourhood. How we manage the formation of the Australian identity and our cohesion is really important, because that is a reality, and we don't have a discriminatory immigration program, and we haven't had it since the White Australia Day, and we don't want it ever returned again. We have been very successful in integrating migrants. This country is known for its success in integrating migrants, and that success. A lot of people, will say, oh, multiculturalism's been a failure and it's divisive. People that say that don't actually understand the Australian community. They have very narrow view of the Australian community. Australian multiculturalism in Australia has been an enormous success, because if it hadn't been successful, we would not be the successful country that we are today. We would be a country of divisions and all sorts of lack of opportunities and discrimination, and we are not that country. So our journey as Australians is to continue to integrate, because we have to have migration, to continue to integrate new waves, new generations of migrants. And political leadership is important, because political leadership and community leadership guide the debate and the discussion around what is an Australian, who is an Australian. I'm an Australian who speaks fluent Greek. Me and 500,000 other Australians, or 7 million of us, have been born overseas. 15 million of us have a parent who's been born overseas. We are not the minority. This is a majority experience. And why multiculturalism has succeeded, and it's enjoyed bipartisanship over a long period of time, and that was critical. Multiculturalism allows migrants who come to this country to be met halfway by those who are already here. So it's okay to keep our cultural inheritance, to keep our language, to share our faiths and our understandings. Now, we do a very good job of that. And yes, there will be the naysayers, and yes, there'll be the ones that'll whinge. But you know what? They're a minority, and we cannot be distracted by what is a minority. There will always be people that don't want others here. But this is a country that has come into modern existence because others came here. They came here 200 years ago. And our biggest problem, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of going forward, and Katie referred to it as well, is that we have yet not reconciled modern Australia with its Indigenous past and its Indigenous inheritance. That is an outstanding issue, and it goes to the core of our capacity to be a wholesome nation and to understand our identity as a whole, which is a multicultural modern country with an ancient Indigenous inheritance. They're the parameters in which I view as the Australian identity. And as a politician, as a community leader, as a parent, as an Australian, I do whatever I can to ensure that discussion always is guided by those principles.
Dr. L, I'm going to pick up on that because you mentioned this as well. Australia in 2050, you referred to some promising developments in terms of Indigenous relations, possibly Indigenous recognition in various forms. Where do you see that being in 2050? Do you think we'll be further down the path in terms of how Australia looks?
I think we have to be. I think there's an absolute inevitability about getting there. And I mean, I think the path has been set, and how we get there, I think, will be messy, because I think change is always a bit messy. But I think by 2050, we'll be on the other side of that, and we have to be. The main thing we have to be is about closing the gap. And so partnering with Indigenous people in the solution is quite critical to that. I think there's been a lot of things done to Indigenous people, firstly, in a negative way, secondly, in a positive way, but not with the right outcomes. And I think we've all moved to a concept of grassroots partnership and understanding the difference and the beauty of the culture, actually. It's the most beautiful, gentle culture, and we have a lot to learn from it as a westernised society. and a lot to partner with, and it's a two-directional interaction. It's not us telling them what to do. And I really welcome the fact that for the first time we're going to have closing the gap outcomes set by the Indigenous communities themselves. I think that's a really positive first step. But to go back to Maria's comment about us being a wonderful multicultural country, I'd like to make the point that we're multicultural and multi-faith, and I would say that the tolerance and diversity kind of rests pretty fairly and pretty squarely on the fact that there's a real religious tolerance in this country, and I think that is quite unique, and it's not often talked about by commentators, but there is this sort of concept that there's a welcoming of when people come to this country. They obviously bring their families, but they bring their faith. And I think that tolerance for faith of others is extremely important and isn't seen as closely in other countries which have their own sort of local Indigenous faith that's very strong. Australians are probably the most sort of agnostic sort of society in the world in some ways, and so there's sort of a willingness and an acceptance, which is a good thing. So we are pretty clear about at what we're not as Australians. I think Australians are very good at saying, well, we're not these things. We're not very good at defining what we are, and therefore it can be painted in by all of this diversity and richness and tolerance. And I think that's a good thing for Australia. I'm always saying I think the only factor that we can clearly say is that we're very honest and authentic, and that we can smell bullshit at 1,000 paces. I reckon that's about the only clear signal from the Australian character that no one can question, and is in spades, and is one of the most defining characters, not just for our people, but our sports people and for our politicians. And, we make a pretty sort of calling a spade a bloody shovel type culture. And I think that works in our diplomacy as well. And I think that's what people recognise in us. And that's about the only defining character I think we have. Other than that, we're pretty easygoing.
I always did say from people from Canada, but if you're meeting Australians, don't casually offer them to, come and visit you, because they actually will. Like, Canadians will say like, oh, you've got to come and visit. You don't intend that person to visit at all. Are you kidding me? But they'll show up.
I always wonder with diplomacy how the diplomats really do it, because they must have to learn a skill set that's not unique to them, not natural to an Australian.
We're going to shift now. We're getting some questions, and we're going to encourage people, if you do have a question, please put it through in the chat box there, and Ahmed is going to forward them to me. We have one here, and we touched on this earlier, and I think it does relate to the time we're going through, this very unusual time. And Dr. Allen, you referred to how this, everybody working from home, this is really teaching people how to be more flexible. This kind of a gathering we're having here tonight. But this could have a huge impact on how the economy of regional cities work in Australia. This, it's been so frustrating for some of these cities over the years. But let me start with you, Maria. How do you think this could be a real game changer in terms of how people think of working from so-called regional cities, how they can make a living doing that?
Well, coincidentally, the Migration Committee had to wrap up an inquiry it was conducting into growing regional Australia. And unfortunately, we had to wrap it up because COVID interrupted our ability to move around, and we weren't able to pursue that. But we did get an opportunity to visit a couple of regional centres, Mount Gambier in South Australia, and hear from places as far away as Kalgoorlie. I think there will always be opportunities for people to use technology in their workplace and then be able to move into a regional, if that's what the question is, sea changing. All this technology is promising, because regional centres need a population, and one of the problems with getting people to move to regional centres is obviously employment, the availability of employment, because we've also ascertained that housing affordability is much better in regional Australia. But more importantly, people who, in order to be enticed to the regions, they need the job. They're attracted by the affordability of housing, but they also want the cultural and social life that the cities offer. And so trying to replicate that in regional Australia is very important to succeeding in attracting people to stay there as well. So if technology can assist with the movement of people out of the cities and into regional Australia for those jobs that can be conducted online and through technology, then I think that that's a great opportunity for growing regional Australia. But regional Australia also needs people to work hands-on. And in fact, the Migration Committee today, our new inquiry is looking at, again, at the disruption that COVID has, the impact of COVID on our working holiday visas because of the borders closing. And lots of our regional centres, agriculture, fruit picking, we were talking to Northern Queensland up in Cairns today, are really desperately short of people. So they rely on the working holiday visa people. But the question we were looking at today is, can we get unemployed Australians at the moment to take up what are lots of jobs that are going to be available in regional Australia? And these are jobs, Herman, that cannot be done on Zoom. And I mean, they actually need hands-on work, anything from hospitality to tourism to agriculture. So yes, for the sea changers that could move into regional Australia and settle there and build communities and of cultural and social mixes, which make then those regions more attractive for people to go and move into to work in the areas that need a physical presence of people. I think it helps, but I don't think it's the silver bullet, so to say, for growing regional Australia. It's more of a sea change and taking congestion out of the city and housing affordability. I hope I've answered that question.
Yeah, that's fine. But Dr. Allen, I want you to expand a little bit more on your point, because I think you had been saying that this has sort of changed people's perceptions in a way of what you could do in a regional city. Is that fair?
No, look, I think the first thing to say is with online sort of presence, I think women have been leading the way for 20 years. I think there are a lot of women who, have a phone on their neck, on their shoulder while they're cooking dinner and changing nappies. And so we got with the program 20 years ago, and I was speaking to someone about, what are some of the legacies going forward and what are the transformative legacies? And someone said, oh, they're going to work out how they can work effectively from home. I'm like, well, you mean men are going to work out how they can effectively work from home? Because we've been doing it for a while now. So I think that there were some predictions that online sort of work, and this is obviously for services, knowledge economy rather than, being able to do fruit picking, which you obviously can't do online. So we're talking about one particular sector of the community. We have to be aware of that. The predictions were that in the next 10 years, it would double from 4% to 8%. And what's happened is COVID has taken it up to 20% within a month. And so that's an extraordinarily transformation. And people argue if it drops back to 10%, which it will drop back, obviously, then it will be, a significant transformation across an employment sector. I've often wondered about this whole decentralisation situation. I was running in the state campaign here in Victoria, and so I was looking very carefully at this issue of decentralisation. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I grew up in Albury, and there was a huge investment by the Hamer Victorian government into making the Twin City of Albury-Wodonga, supported by the Whitlam government at the time. And there was a huge attempts to really decentralise to Albury and Wodonga, and there were great services, great schools. I went to one of the best high schools in New South Wales. My father was a doctor in the local hospital. There were executives that had been decentralised because they moved industries and manufacturing, Uncle Ben's and Uncle Toby's, up to Wodonga, so literally hundreds of jobs were taken up there, and they put in good roads. But it was too far from the critical centre of Melbourne or Sydney. And I have this very strong belief that decentralisation hubs have to be at least, can only be 1 hour. And that's maybe a bit over 1 hour, but that's because people in the city commute an hour. So an hour seems to be about the magic number, maybe 1 to 1.5 hours. But at the time I lived in Albury, it was more like 4 hours. And that's too far for people to get the services they need. So I think if we're going to think about decentralisation, we've got to think about it as a hub and spoke approach. I think they need to be regional satellite cities that are close enough to Melbourne that you can get there for your tertiary service, or that you can get there for your, orthodontic appointment, or your orthopaedic appointment, or your, specific skill that can only be provided by critical mass. But I think also we need to think about these regional hubs again as being their own critical mass. So a lot of the towns that are sort of, the one-shop towns are really dying as we speak at the moment. And they can only be rejuvenated if they've got a little hub as well. So you've got a hub and spoke where Melbourne, for instance, has maybe 5 regional cities at the most, 3 to 5 regional cities that hub and spoked around it. Geelong's one example, but there's Bendigo and Ballarat, and there's another couple that you could think of. And then from those, there's a hub and spoke of other people maybe who are living outside those regional centres. But I think that one-shop town living is actually more problematic. Those people need to come into the services of a regional centre. But you don't have to have everyone working in those regional centres. They just need to be able to send their kids locally to schools. They need to be able to access emergency care from hospitals, but they can actually either do commuting by Zoom or commuting by train. So the key to these decentralised regions, which works beautifully in Melbourne and Victoria because it's so flat, is fast train. So having a European style connection. Now that doesn't work for all the capital cities, but Perth, for instance, Melbourne, Brisbane, they all work for those. Sydney's a little bit more problematic. But those are the sorts of things that I think Australians are looking for. And I think internet presence is making people think very differently about the lifestyle that they want to lead.
All right, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here to some of the questions that we're getting on chat. This is a pretty obvious one, Maria Vamvakinou. By 2050, will Australia be a republic? Will we have an Australian-born head of state?
Well, I'm not going to. I'd like to think that we will be a republic, but I do also, and I'm a strong supporter of a republic because I believe that would be the fulfilment of, a final ownership of the Australian identity. But I'm going to be hopeful that we'll get there. But at the moment, this debate around the republic sort of ebbs and wanes, and we're in a bit of a low period. I think we need something dramatic to reignite the fervour and the passion of Australians to want an Australian head of state. And so I'm going to be hoping that the next generation of leaders, Australian leaders, have that passion for the Australian identity and want to see it fully realised in an Australian head of state. So I'm not a betting person, but because I would like an Australian republic and I wouldn't mind being around for it, I'm going to say that we should be and will be a republic by 2050.
Katie Ellen, that's 30 years away. What do you think?
Oh, it's not a matter of if we are, it's a matter of when, and it will be by 2050. I've no doubt about that whatsoever. We know the majority of Australians want a republic. The biggest issue is political inertia, and I don't mean from the politicians, I actually mean from the community. Australians are very pragmatic and they have a view of don't fix what ain't broken. And unfortunately, Maria, I think you're right, but I say unfortunately, we need some dramatic event to make us realise that, in fact, we are already a republic. We just don't have that finalised, decoupled head of state. And the thing that worries me is that if we wait for history to make us make a choice, it'll be for a sort of crisis or an urgent problem that will make us get over that inertia, and it might mean that we may end up with the wrong model. So I think there's some work going on in the background for people who think that this is the way forward. It would be good for us to think very carefully about what we want, what do we wish for. My guess is, because we're so referential and derivative, that when we get a strong, respected US president, we might be more willing to take the step. But Australians look to the UK and look to the US. We're happy with our UK association, but we look to the US, and I think there are many people in Australia who are not very happy with the current president. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn by saying that. They were with Obama. We had a huge supportive environment from Australia towards Obama. And I think that Trump has made us feel a bit more cynical and sceptical about an elected president. And I think while we have the Queen still as our head of state, there's a lot of tradition and sentimentality about that. But I think it's just a matter of when, and I'm quite certain, I'll put a bet on that one, Maria, I'm quite certain we'll be 50.
Good, I'm glad.
Next question, Maria. Obviously, I'm talking to two very well-informed, passionate politicians who are women. Will Australia's next female prime minister be treated better, have an easier time, and perhaps fewer double standards than were applied to Julia Gillard?
I I'd like to think that the answer to that is yes. And I'm confident because our next female Prime Minister will probably come from a new generation of women in politics. I look at my daughter's generation, they're a lot more fearless, a lot more certain about who they are. And that sort of fearlessness and certainty about self will mean that they will have greater opportunity to change the narrative around women in politics. I mean, there's a lot of work has happened even in the last 18 years since I've been in Parliament. When I entered Parliament, there were less women. We didn't have any babies. And, 18 years later, not only did we get the childcare centre, we've got, colleagues having children while they're serving parliamentarians. We've got babies coming into the chamber during divisions. There's been an enormous change. I'd like to think that with Julia's Prime Ministership, the culture around politics got over its whatever problem it had with women potentially as leaders, and now we can move on. And the next female leader, I think, would find that that ceiling has been cracked, it's been broken, and I've got a lot of confidence in the younger women that I meet and speak with, and I believe that they're going to be very capable of leading this country on their terms as individuals first and foremost, and possibly as women and anything else second, third and fourth. So there's a stronger sense of self and identity, and I think that that's where I'm optimistic that it won't be as bad the second time round.
Katie Allen, do you share that opinion?
Actually, Maria, I have to say, I'm going to call you out on this because in some ways I don't think you realise that your comments are kind of reflecting that Julia didn't have a strong sense of self. And I think that's not the case at all. I think the problem is actually is the political conversation that has happened. And I think we should be very careful never to say women are the problem because that's not the problem.
No, I didn't think, I didn't imply that. Yeah. It's the thing around the first woman Prime Minister, everything from media to culture that needed to be, that's what I think is going to be changed. Yes.
I think community conversations in general have changed, and I think also that the community is tired of partisanship. I think there's a hunger, a thirst for people here bipartisanship. And what I hear, we have to be careful we don't have kind of, a suppression of discussion and argument, fierce argument. But I like to use the analogy of playing the ball. And I think in the case of Julia Gillard, there was far too much man-handling, and there needs to be much more clear clarity about where we're taking an idea. And so, in my view, there seems to be in this 46th Parliament, and this is what I've said to other people, a bit of bipartisanship about ideas and less being reduced to childish name-calling and silliness like that. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not theatre, and I have to say we all enjoy a bit of theatre, and when people watch Question Time, they are appalled by it. I think it's this Parliament, my understanding, is less divisive, but maybe that's not true. You've been in many more years than me, Maria, so you can probably concur or not. But I think that it reflects a new generation of parliamentarians coming through, and also the community's expectation that they want a respectful and fiercely debated dialogue. So disagreeing is not disrespectful. Disagreeing is important. That is what Parliament is about. It is about the contest of ideas, and you and I can vigorously disagree respectfully. And I hope that that's what we need to do to make sure we keep everyone in Parliament to account, whether we're male, female, or.
Right. I've got one final question, and it's an interesting one, and then we'll wrap up. This has come through on the chat line. When will we get to a point, Maria, I'll ask you first, when will we get to a point where we don't have to specify multicultural or CALD community, knowing that when we say Australian, multiculturalism is in our fabric and I don't need to be categorized?
Well, I'd like to think that that's a very good question, because I get asked that question quite a bit. In fact, after all these years of living in Australia and growing up here, I ask myself the same question: when is it going to be obvious? Why? And the answer to that is, I said before that we come here in different waves and at different times. And So for me, that's been here for, 5.5 decades, I've worked it all out. My generation's worked it all out. We have skin in the game. We're Australian, we own the joint. But there's a whole lot of new people that are coming to Australia, and certainly my electorate. I mean, I have, I'm the recipient, the Federal Seat of Call is the recipient of all of the refugees out of Iraq and Syria in the last 25 years. I have the biggest constituency that observe the Muslim faith. I mean, people come here at different stages, and we're not all on the same page. So most recently, you will be familiar with the outbreak in Victoria, and there was an issue around whether people couldn't speak English and there wasn't enough of this or there wasn't enough of that. The truth is that there will always be a need to remind ourselves that we are a multicultural country. We have non-English speaking people here amongst us, and we need to continue to service multiculturalism at that level to ensure that there is access and equity available for everybody. So it's going to be around. I don't think it's a reflection of our inability to accept who we are. It's more a reflection on the fact that we're not all here at the same time. The previous Australians, people talk about 5 generations Australian. I'm only 1.5 because I was born overseas and I grew up here. So they gave my generation a 0.5, My children are 2, second generation. So we're all here at different stages. What matters is that we all understand that, and we make allowances for the fact that, there are going to be people who are going to be described as people of non-English speaking backgrounds. That's a reality. I'm no longer, I'm still a person of non-English speaking background. My parents were. My kids are not of non-English speaking background, but they are of Greek inheritance. So the language changes to also acknowledge that it's not about language, what sort of language background you're from, but what cultural inheritance you're from or where your heritage is from. So this is what multiculturalism is, and I see it more as something not to be worried about or critical about, but to accept as that's just the way, we are here in Australia, and that's what I love about the Australian identity. It's organic, it's forever growing and changing, but at the same time, it's important to maintain a cohesion around being an Australian. And I think that, we have to work at that, and that's part of the excitement of being an Australian, as far as I'm concerned.
Katie Hall, when do you think that will that happen? That multiculturalism is so accepted we don't even have to talk about it anymore?
Look, I have to say, I think cultures are accepted, but I think if I was to lay one criticism of Australia, it's not a criticism that I think we can do anything about. We are monoglottic. We speak English, and that is it. And I think it's very, very good that there's been this massive encouragement and compulsory English as a second, English languages other than English being taught in primary school, though they're not taught with any great sort of enthusiasm, I think it would be fair to say. But I think it's good and important that children are exposed to the second language, because people in Europe are often immersed in multiple languages. So they have an understanding of what it feels like to not understand another language. They have that experience of what it feels like to be other. And I think for Australians, we're defined by even our language is an Australian language, it's not English. And it, for our young to experience what it must be like as a migrant who doesn't speak English, who comes to this country, who suddenly finds as a young woman going into labour from Somalia, who doesn't understand that she's in labour, she can't speak to anyone, and suddenly she wakes up without a uterus and she's lost a baby, and no one even told her that she was going through labour. I mean, there's some extraordinary experiences that people who come to the country without English go through that are seared into their experiences, and it's terrible, really frightening for them. So as long as people continue to come to the country without English as a first language, there will be shocking experiences. We need to be understanding of how that, causes scars for life, really. But at the end of the day, English is becoming a rapidly spoken language around the world. And I think that encouraging people and supporting them to learn English, not because I believe a monoglottic culture is the best culture, it's just that if you're going to survive and thrive in Australia, you'll be able to, get a job, 2, communicate with the community, 3, understand the value set that we all subscribe to, things like rule of law and a tolerant and diverse democracy. But also you can get services. And so, learning English, I think, is an important thing for people because they will have a better experience when they're here in Australia. And when I did a lot of door knocking into Paran, and there were these wonderful Russians who didn't speak English during the 80s and 90s. And they told me through their children, because I'd point to the phone and they'd ring their daughter or their son. And their sons were in their 40s and 50s because these people came here in the 90s from the breaking down of the USSR. And the children told me that parents didn't ever learn English, so they never got a job. They were given Russian television, and so they were in housing commission houses and they were, keeping well, but they produced this amazing offspring, and the offspring were out there, the scientists, the engineers, the doctors of the world. They're very educated, and these people themselves had been scientists and engineers and doctors, just hadn't been able to get a job late in their life when they'd actually fled from Russia. And it really drove home to me that because they couldn't speak English, they were really isolated from the community. They'd certainly been productive citizens, literally, with having offspring who'd become even more productive citizens. But it did sort of drive home to me that English is the key to having a good life in Australia. Whether that's right or wrong, it just is. And we need to support ensuring they get access to those services that they need, and that means learn English to some degree.
All right, we'll leave it there. Some would say it's English. It's a very interesting dialect. I'll say that as somebody who comes from overseas. I want to thank very much Maria Vamvakinou and Dr. Katie Allen for joining us this evening, for having this chat. I want to thank AIS as well for inviting me on board to moderate this. I do want to remind everyone that next week there's another program happening at the same time, Prayer, Patience, and Pandemic. It's an interfaith program with the AIS and with Trinity College, which is part of the University of Divinity. So that will be an interesting evening. Hopefully everybody can catch that. And thank you for watching. Thanks very much.
Good night. Pleasure.
Bye.